The very first thing you notice about most Ukrainian churches are the domes. They're beautifully curved, and they rise up above the buildings, where they're usually topped off with a Christian cross. If you look at enough Ukrainian churches, you'll soon notice that the domes usually sit on top of 8-sided towers, and these towers all have windows in them. Windows that throw light down into the interior of the church below. But these towers are more than light shafts. In fact, it's the towers that are pushing the dome so high up into the sky and making them so noticeable. If there's trees, the towers push the domes up above the branches. And if there's fields, the towers push the domes up high, where they sit sharply outlined against the sky. Ukraine itself has a lot of wide, flat fields, and it also has a lot of forests and mountains. But whatever their surroundings, Ukrainians have always pushed the domes of their churches up, making them tall, easily recognizable landmarks. The high domes are a strong tradition. But there are other things that are common to most Ukrainian churches too. All of these churches are actually in Toronto, Canada, but they all grow out of the traditional churches built in Ukraine. One of these traditions has to do with doors and windows. Many Ukrainian churches angle off the upper corners of their doors and windows. If you see things that look like this, there's a pretty good chance you're looking at a Ukrainian church. And if you try to find the bells on a lot of Ukrainian churches, you'll discover that they're usually in their own separate building. On this traditional wooden church, the little building is made of wood, while on this modern one, it's built of stone and copper. But in both cases, the tradition of a separate bell tower is still there. But whatever they're made of, wood or brick, stone or glass, there is one way in which almost all Ukrainian churches are exactly the same. And this comes right back to the domes again, and in particular, the main central dome, the big one on the middle. That dome is much more than just a prominent tower, and it's a lot more than just a practical way of getting light into the building. In fact, its most important purpose is really only clear from inside the building. Because Ukrainian churches are traditionally built to be models of the Christian universe. The dome is actually a symbol of heaven, and the fact that it arches right over the center of the main space where people worship inside is no mistake at all. With heaven above and the Christian faithful worshiping below, a Ukrainian church really does become a model of the Christian universe itself. So, a traditional Ukrainian church is a model of the Christian universe. A model that is best experienced from inside the building. A model with the earthly world below and the Christian heaven above. The big central dome represents heaven. The heavenly light streams in through the windows of the tower. And at the center of the dome, there is often Jesus Christ, depicted as the judge of all humanity. But this vertical heaven-to-earth axis is only one of the two important lines that organize the spaces of a traditional Ukrainian church. The second line usually runs from west to east, cutting through the three main spaces of the building, the narthex, the nave, and the sanctuary. This line is a journey from the everyday world outside the church to the holiest space within. And every door and every step marks an increase in the sacredness of the spaces. The first space is the narthex, and it's located just inside the front doors. It's a gathering area, but in the very first Christian churches, it was where non-Christians had to wait while the sacred rituals were performed further on inside the building. Doors separate the narthex from the next basic space, the nave. This is the main space, the place of the Christian congregation in the church, and the symbolic earthly world below the heavenly dome above. Often, in the most traditional Ukrainian churches, there is no fixed seating in the nave. People simply stand. From the nave, a series of steps lead up to a kind of low stage. These steps mark the transition from the place of the people to the place of the clergy inside the church. This low stage is dominated by a large screen called an ikonostas in Ukrainian. It is usually the most lavishly decorated item inside the church. And here are the most important doors along the axis through the church. These are called the royal doors, and only the clergy are allowed to pass through them and into the third space, the sanctuary. In the sanctuary is the holy altar, where many of the most sacred rituals are performed. But this altar is not the end of the line through the church. The line continues into the space behind the altar. And here, there are usually paintings of Jesus Christ on earth, arrayed below a major image of the Mother of God, Mary. These paintings are the end of the line. But the faithful, the line from west to east, ends in a vision of their God on earth. And that makes perfect sense, because they believe that one day their God will return to earth and come from the east. If they cast their eyes up, they encounter a painting of their God as judge in heaven. So the horizontal line through the church leads to an image of their God on earth, and the vertical line up to the dome leads to an image of their God in heaven. It's amazing, really. The building and the paintings are working together to create the model of the Christian universe. And it's a universe that's filled out by other paintings on the walls, images of Christian saints, martyrs, and scenes from the Christian scriptures. These paintings actually have a special name. They're called frescoes, and using the interior surfaces of the building as a canvas for a painted model of the universe is a very old way of making a church. But it is not unique to Ukrainian Christianity. In fact, it came into Ukraine with the official acceptance of the Christian religion itself. And that happened just over 1,000 years ago. Christianity officially arrived in Ukraine in the year 988 AD, when the prince Volodymyr adopted it as the religion of his ancient Ukrainian state. The faith arrived by way of the Dnipro River, a trade route that connected the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity at Constantinople to the Viking settlements of Scandinavia. Today, it is known as Istanbul, and it's in modern-day Turkey. But back then, it was Constantinople, and it was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and one of the most cultured and powerful cities in the world. The churches Constantinople exported to Ukraine were usually built of brick, and had a long, narrow narthex, a big square nave, and a sanctuary that ended in a semicircular space called the apse. The dome sat above the nave on 4 big columns, and since these columns created a cross shape within the square walls of the nave, this type is usually called a cross-in-square church. Sometimes cross-and-square churches had smaller domes too, placed over the corners of the building, making a total of 5. But the ancient Ukrainians seemed to like height in their religious buildings, so they pulled the Byzantine churches they'd imported skyward towards a single, very tall central dome. By the year 1200 AD, this is what Ukrainians had done to the churches brought up from Constantinople. It's like the whole building was stepping up to that central heavenly dome. But as different as they were starting to look, these churches still contained the paintings of the Byzantine churches that made them models of the Christian universe. It's just that in their quest for height, they were becoming something new, something more distinctly Ukrainian. But this new Ukrainian style didn't have long to develop, and these early experiments ended abruptly when around 1243 AD, the Mongolian descendants of Genghis Khan conquered most of the ancient Ukrainian state. The capital at Kiev and its glorious churches were largely destroyed, and it was only in the western hills, beyond the reach of the Mongol overlords, that major brick and stone churches continued to be built. And because these were so close to Central Europe, these churches began taking on more European design ideas. Throughout the rest of Ukraine, the ongoing evolution of the Byzantine churches fell to nameless carpenters building small wooden churches in the countryside. There had likely been wooden churches in Ukraine since Christianity itself arrived, and the earliest were probably nothing more than the 3 basic spaces of narthex, nave, and sanctuary, constructed as 3 basic log buildings. But early on, even these little buildings took on the Ukrainian preference for height. Some got pulled up into 3 very tall boxes, with 3 very tall peaked roofs, and each roof clearly marked the narthex, the nave, and the sanctuary. The remarkable work of these nameless carpenters would play an influential role in the next great era of Ukrainian churches, an era when brick and stone churches were constructed once again. And what makes that era interesting is that it really begins in the other ancient hub of Christianity, in Rome. By the 1600s, the Mongolian overlords were long gone, but Ukraine itself was divided into 2 regions on either side of the Dnipro River. To the east was an independent Ukrainian state practicing Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and to the west was a Polish-Lithuanian Empire. Within this region, most Ukrainians continued to practice their Orthodox faith. But because the empire was officially Roman Catholic, this part of modern Ukraine absorbed Roman Catholic styles of architecture. And at that time, the height of fashion for Roman Catholic churches was a flamboyant architectural style called the Baroque. Nobody really knows exactly how the Baroque style got to Ukraine. It might have come overland from Poland or up the Dnipro River from the Mediterranean. But however it traveled, when it arrived, it was enthusiastically adopted by both Roman Catholic and Orthodox Ukrainians on both sides of the river. It's the Baroque that brought exterior architecture to Ukrainian churches. You see, up to that point, the buildings had followed the traditions of Constantinople. They'd focused on the interior, where the painted model of the universe was. The outsides were usually left pretty plain and undecorated. But the Baroque brought classical columns and arches, lots of color, and a funny kind of high, curving front wall. And most importantly, it was the Baroque style that transformed the old rounded domes of Constantinople into the gracefully curving cupola domes that have stayed the popular choice for Ukrainian churches right down to today. And the Baroque didn't just change the shape of the domes, it changed their locations sometimes as well. In one variation, it's as though the corners of the Byzantine cross and square church have disappeared and left only the cross. And the Baroque domes followed to new positions above the arms of the cross. It's not hard to see the three domes of the wooden churches marking the narthex, nave, and sanctuary in these cross-shaped churches. Just like it's not hard to see the height of the wooden churches in the height of so many Baroque Ukrainian buildings. But again, this era of Ukrainian architecture didn't last long. And again, it was politics that ended the experiments. By the mid-1700s, the Ukrainian state east of the Dnipro River was increasingly dominated by Imperial Moscow, and the regions west of the river became more and more tied to the culture of Central Europe. The cultural influences were overwhelming, and so from then until now, there has never been another identifiable Ukrainian style of Christian church. But that's not to say that Ukrainians don't possess a very rich legacy. They can choose from three great eras: the ancient churches of Constantinople, their own extraordinary wooden churches, and the exuberant buildings of the Baroque period. It's pretty unusual to find any Ukrainian church that doesn't in some way look back to one or even all of these three great building traditions. And so, modern Ukrainian churches often refer back to the three great building traditions of Ukrainian church architecture. Their domes are usually arranged in one of the two classic patterns, either in the corners like the cross and square churches of Constantinople, or on the arms like the cross-shaped churches of the Baroque period. The Baroque domes themselves are by far the most popular, but they are joined by regional styles of wooden domes and by abstracted versions of the old rounded domes of Constantinople. Some churches literally copy old motifs, like the high curving front walls that came in with the Baroque style, while others produce sophisticated references back to the basic forms. Like on this one, the roof seems to grow right out of the sloping roofs of the ancient wooden churches. And sure enough, on the inside, the roof is made of wood. But here's the blending. At the top, modern domes made out of fiberglass look back to the rounded domes of Constantinople. But they're laid out in a cross shape that looks back to the churches of the Baroque period. There's a lot of influences at work here. But whatever their big references, most of these churches are Ukrainian in their smallest details too. They're Ukrainian in the beautiful wooden inlays of their crosses. And they're Ukrainian in the exquisite embroidery of their altar cloths. And of course, in the end, they're Ukrainian in the communities that come to worship within them. Ukrainian church architecture is unique in the sense that it's essentially the same for both Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians. These are, at their core, Byzantine buildings, where both groups practice Eastern Orthodox rituals. They're a complex blend of three great religious building traditions, and they're not easily pinned down. Perhaps in a way, they're a bit like Ukrainian Christianity itself. They're the result of over 1,000 years of different influences. But as new domes continue to rise around the world, all Ukrainian churches are potent symbols of that enduring faith. A faith that came upriver from Constantinople all those years ago.